So hello, welcome back to the explanation of specific kind of fallacies. And in this recording, we'll focus on the violations of the starting point rule. This is the sixth rule for a critical discussion, and it looks like this. So we have a party may not falsely present a premise as an accepted starting point, or deny a premise representing an accepted starting point. And for understanding this rule, it's important to know what we mean by starting points. And they are as much as you expect. So they are the point of departures for your discussion. So if I, for instance, argue that we should invest in solar power because that would reduce climate change, and I think then that climate change is very real, that would be a starting point in my discussion, so that climate change is real. And if you accept it and accept the relations between the argument and the standpoint that I presented, then you are convinced. But if you don't accept my starting point, it's very hard to be convinced by my argumentation, right? So here you can see actually that it might therefore also be attractive to present starting points as though they are accepted by the antagonist. And this is where it can go wrong. So take a look at the following example. And it's an example that I constructed myself, but you find these kind of reasoning patterns in all kind of discussion boards about conspiracy theories. And this is one about the Illuminati. And they are supposedly people in power, or actually beings that take over people in power in order to establish a new world order. But they do so in a very secret way. So here goes the argumentation. The Illuminati are secretly yielding their power, and the fact that you don't hear anything about them exactly proves that. So you see, they are working in secret. Now, if you believe in this conspiracy theory, then you probably think this argumentation is acceptable. But if you don't believe in that theory, I don't think you will be convinced by it. And the reason for it is that in the argument, so you don't hear anything about them, that assumes that these Illuminati are working in secret. But that's the standpoint actually, and that is something that you haven't accepted yet because you're doubting it or you don't believe it and you think the opposite. So this is really problematic in this argumentation because actually the acceptability of the standpoint is presupposed in the argument. And you might actually know this kind of fallacy because it's a very well-known fallacy. It's a violation of the starting point rule because it's falsely presented as a starting point here. And the fallacy's name is circular reasoning. It's also called begging the question, by the way, or petitio principii. And it was already on the list of Aristotle's 13 original fallacies. And this is the first time, as far as we know, that there was made an inventory of fallacies. Now, another starting point rule violation that was on this list by Aristotle is usually illustrated by the following example. When did you stop beating your spouse? Which is an odd question, I must admit, but it was even worse before because traditionally this fallacy that I'm going to discuss was illustrated by the question, when did you stop beating your wife? See, so I think there's some kind of improvement going on here. Anyway, what's problematic about this question is when you use it in a discussion about whether or not someone has beaten their spouse, then it sort of introduces a starting point that this person has beaten his or her spouse, and that, of course, if that's under discussion still, that's of course not really reasonable to do. You actually ask many questions at once, which is accidentally also the name of this fallacy. It's called the fallacy of many questions. And stop and take a look at this question more closely. So I can imagine that this question is actually not a fallacy in certain contexts. And think about the question that you have to ask before in order to really see why it is sometimes in certain contexts not fallacious. Now it's something like this. So if we ask first, have you ever beaten your spouse? And the answer is affirmative, then when did you stop beating your spouse is not at all problematic. It's only in those cases when the answer was no to the first question. So you see there are two questions asked at once, and that's why actually the first proposition, so you have beaten your spouse, is introduced as though it's an accepted starting point, but in most of the cases I assume that would not be the case. So then you smuggle in the starting point, it's a violation of the starting point rule. So back to this rule. Now we've seen actually the first part of the rule. It's illustrated by these fallacies. So if you violate this starting point rule, that could be done by falsely presenting something as an accepted starting point, so by means of a circular reasoning argument or a fallacy of many questions. But of course, it could also be done actually by denying an accepted starting point. So this would, for example, be the case if you were to argue that we should invest in windmills, for instance, because that would reduce climate change. And I would all of a sudden deny climate change. And I just gave you the example in which I accepted that climate change was real, but now I'm the same person, but now I deny it. That would be denying an accepted starting point. So that would also amount to a violation of this rule. Now it could be the case that you find these examples a little bit far-fetched, but I should say that in real-life argumentation, violations of the starting point rule do occur. And a very famous example is this one. It's an utterance by a former president of the US, George W. Bush. And he did this immediately after the 9/11 attacks. And he actually wanted to start what he called the war on terrorism, the war on terror. And so he says here that every nation has a role in this war. He says, every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you are with the terrorist. Now I tried to say it as forcefully as Bush did, but in any case you see what he's doing here, right? So he's polarizing the situation, you're with us or against us basically, as though there is no middle ground, as though you can't be a little bit with the US and a little bit with yourself. Probably no one would choose the terrorists, but somewhere in between the US and the terrorists. So this is called a false dilemma. It's not mentioned in the textbook by Van Emeren and Snoek Henkemans, but I would argue that it is at least falsely presenting something as an accepted starting point, namely that you have two choices. So here you can see that in practice it can go wrong with the starting point rule. Okay, I hope this was clear. Any questions you can post on the discussion board or ask me on Skype. And for now, thanks for your attention and take a look at the other clips. Bye!